Thanks so much for joining us and welcome. I want to begin by acknowledging that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. I pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. My name is Caitlin Clerkin, and I am the Frederick Randolph Grace Curatorial Fellow in Ancient Art at the Harvard Art Museums. This virtual conversation is part of the suite of programming that accompanies a special exhibition at the museums, Funerary Portraits from Roman Egypt, Facing Forward, on view now and through the end of December. I'll just say a few words about the format of this event before I introduce our guest, Dr. Lissette Jiménez. This conversation is taking place in the Zoom webinar format. I'll speak to Dr. Jiménez for about 20 minutes before turning to audience questions for the remainder of the time. I invite you to pop questions or comments in the Q&A box as they occur to you throughout the conversation, and we'll turn to these in the final portion of the program. So to introduce our guest, Dr. Jiménez is assistant professor at San Francisco State University, where she also serves as undergraduate coordinator in museum studies. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies, with an emphasis in Egyptian art and archaeology. She has conducted archaeological fieldwork at numerous sites in Egypt and Greece, and she's currently the director of the Abydos Archive Conservation Field School for the Abydos Temple Paper Archives Project, a collaborative project between the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, UC Berkeley, and Egyptian colleagues that provides hands-on conservation training to Egyptian museum staff and inspectors. Dr. Jiménez has published and presented numerous invited lectures, including on her main area of research, the visually impressive funerary shrouds from ancient Egypt, a main topic of our conversation today. Her current book project explores how funerary shrouds should be contextualized within the ancient Egyptian context in which they were created and used, the colonial context in which they were removed from Egypt, and the modern context in which they are displayed in museums for public viewing. She's shared her expertise as an essay contributor to the online digital companion to the exhibition, and we're thrilled that she's here with us today. Thanks for joining us, Lissette.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I'm really excited to be here today to chat about one of my favorite subjects, obviously. I wanted to begin by thinking about, by adding some context, obviously, which is thinking about Roman period funerary practices and perhaps how some of those practices changed and what was new during this period in particular. So first, let me say the disclaimer or warning that this presentation does contain images of wrapped mummified individuals. There are no exposed human remains, but obviously there are some shrouded human remains in this presentation. For example, here is a shroud of a woman named Cleopatra, and it's still attached to her mummified body. And so this is a really interesting example in terms of what is new during the Roman period and what traditions were carried on over from the Pharaonic period. So mummification obviously was still conducted during the Roman period. And it was important to continue to preserve the body. Now that changed over time. During the Roman period in particular, a lot of the internal organs or viscera were left inside the body. And so as a result, embalmers had a tendency to use a lot of bitumen, a lot of resins. They sort of poured that over to really preserve the body in a different way because everything was still left inside and was intact. And so as a result, you didn't have these additional funerary objects like canopic jars. Canopic jars traditionally held the internal organs of the deceased and were put inside the burial. So those objects were no longer in use, or they were sort of phased out throughout the end of the Ptolemaic period into the Roman period. And so what mattered more was really the decoration of the body. And you can see here in the shroud of Cleopatra, she's bandaged up, but her shroud has pretty much all the decoration that she would have needed. It would have accompanied her body. And there are several funerary objects that were also included in her burial. She has you can see here at the bottom, there on left, there's sort of a linen pad for her head. There were some beads, a comb, the remains of a funerary wreath. She also did have a coffin. as well. So in some cases, people were buried inside of coffins, and others, there were no coffins. So they're definitely paring down the burial ensemble in the Roman period, and focusing more on ornamentation of the body and the representation of the individual through various means. And part of that is because we see more communal burials during this period. That's something that's new. That's a bit of an innovation in terms of these large monumental burial structures. Here is an example from Kol Mel Shakafa in Alexandria, where you see these large monumental tombs with banqueting halls, and here on the left, what looks kind of like little cubby holes, they're called loculi, and that's where the deceased would have been, sort of the body of the deceased would have been placed inside. So you would have had access to that body. Multiple individuals would have shared one loculus. So you have hundreds of individuals that would have been buried within these kinds of structures. And on the right, you have a triclinium, which is a banqueting hall. So we know that people came and celebrated the deceased either in their initial burial or for different commemorative purposes. And we also know from textual sources that it's likely that they also pulled the bodies of the deceased and ate with them and banqueted with them in celebration. So that's something that continues on over from Pharaonic period, but is also something that's relatively new in terms of these larger communal spaces, decoration specifically on the body as well.
I had a question while you were talking. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about why it's important to represent the deceased in Egyptian funerary practice, and maybe also in the context of the Roman practice. And then I think your next slide.
Yeah, I think that this is this is a great visual aid to that. So it was important to represent the deceased because this was essentially a surrogate of the deceased. So if anything physically happened to the body, if the body was ever compromised, the deceased could continue on. They could continue existing through their physical representation. And so you see here, these are three examples of three different kinds of traditions that were used during the Roman period. You have funerary masks here on the left. This funerary mask is particularly interesting because it also sort of mimics tomb decoration. You can see at the very top the traditional Egyptian stylized representations that you would have seen on pharaonic tombs, but are now being incorporated into the representation of the deceased. And you have this, stunning visual representation of the deceased that's molded in the mask. And the image in the center is a so-called, mummy portrait, or a painted funerary portrait that's been inserted into this gilded coffin that's been molded, that also has traditional Egyptian funerary scenes, but they're on the body of the deceased. So you can see this interplay between the significance of representing the deceased image, but also incorporating, traditional Egyptian iconography that's associated with the afterlife and the deceased journey into the afterlife. And then on the far right is a funerary shroud of a young boy that's still on his mummified body, and he's still inside of his coffin, where you can see, more emphasis on his physical representation. There's less iconography in terms of traditional Egyptian elements, but when you think about the broader context and the decoration on the coffin, which you can't necessarily see here, there is still this interplay between Egyptian and Hellenistic funerary traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we have kind of an introduction to these different options, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about shrouds, starting with how common they were, if we know, and why one might choose a shroud amongst these other options for the burial.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So most people are familiar with funerary portraits, as I mentioned, and that's partly because we have, there are at least 1,000 of them that are still preserved. Funerary shrouds, we have less. In the research that I've done, I've found at least, 130 or so. So it's probably somewhere between 100 to 200 shrouds that are preserved in museum collections. Now, I caution that that's probably an undercount for a variety of reasons. One is because these shrouds were sold into the art market. So there are probably a few of them many of them maybe, that are in private collections. Two, these kinds of shrouds were easily folded up, put into collections, and sort of forgotten about. There have been stories of museums, doing inventories of their collections, looking at some of the linen that's in their collections, unfolding it and realizing, oh, this is a decorated shroud. Let's conserve it. Let's study it. So that's happening more frequently. Museums are discovering that they do have shrouds, decorated shrouds in their collections as well. And also, this material is really at the mercy of the archaeological record and preservation, right? So a lot of these shrouds likely were not preserved. They were torn off bodies, or they were they disintegrated due to preservation issues. So that probably has affected how many are still in existence. Almost certainly has affected how many are in existence. But so that's part of the reason why we don't necessarily know how common this type of funerary practice was. But we do know that this was one option individuals had in addition to making masks or funerary portraits, smaller painted portraits, or larger decorated shrouds. And so in terms of who would have had a funerary shroud, these are really good examples because they all have names associated with them. So we know this is Cleopatra on the left. This is Tasheret-Horudja that's on display at the Harvard Art Museums. It's in the center. And this is an individual named Neferhotep. So all of these individuals we know come from a priestly class. Their families were part of a priestly class. So that gives us some indication that the individuals who were creating shrouds likely came from an elite status, for lack of a better word. Some individuals who had the means to dedicate resources to creating these types of objects for their burials. So they were higher status individuals. Not all were associated with the priestly class, but at least from some of the inscriptions, we know that they were higher status individuals.
Mm-hmm. Does their kind of membership in a priestly class, do you have any sense of whether that kind of commits those families or those individuals to particular kinds of funerary rituals or fidelity to longer term practices rather than others?
That's a really good question. In Thebes, we probably have the most examples in terms of priestly class burials and individuals in the way that they're being represented in their burials. And I would say that we have really interesting sort of combinations of masks and shrouds and portraits and coffins, but they definitely do skew a little bit more traditional in terms of Egyptian iconography. For example, the shroud of Cleopatra, I'll get into it a little bit more in terms of her shroud type, but there is sort of this tendency to adhere to more traditional Egyptian artistic styles for some of the priestly class shrouds. But again, it's hard to say because not all of them have inscriptions, not all of them identify the deceased. So that's kind of a tricky question to answer.
Right. Could you then now tell us about these different types, since we referred to them a few times? Yeah.
Well, and as you can see, there are some interesting iconographic elements or characteristics to each of them, and I'll go into that. In my research, I've identified that there are 5 types of funerary shrouds based on their composition and their iconography. So the shroud here on the left is an Osiris shroud. And what that means is that the deceased is represented as the god Osiris. You can see it's very traditional in terms of Egyptian iconography and style. The deceased facial features are idealized. They're represented as the god. In this case, there's gilding on the face, representing the individual's transfigured status as the deity, in association with the deity. You have the false beard, the crook and the flail, which are traditional iconographic symbols of the god, the mummified body as well, because Osiris in his myth is the prototype essentially for the practice of mummification in ancient Egypt. And you have deities and traditional iconography along the side. Some of these Osiris shrouds are interesting too, because down the center, there's a band where you usually find an inscription identifying the deceased. In some cases, there's an inscription, and others we see that that's missing. So that also is kind of an interesting sign in terms of how these were produced. It's possible that these were mass produced and then personalized afterwards with inscriptions for the deceased. But either way, this is one way that the deceased could represent and align themselves with the god Osiris. And in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, you start to see Hathor becoming more popular, especially her association with women. So women now had this female counterpart to associate themselves with in the afterlife, female counterpart to Osiris. And these shrouds depict the goddess Hathor with her traditional tripartite Egyptian wig, her sheath dress. You see vignettes along the side of Egyptian deities, gods from the underworld, protective deities, all helping the deceased as they transition into the underworld as well. And you also get that band in the center where sometimes we have inscriptions naming the deceased, aligning the deceased. The deceased would be Hathor, Hathor so-and-so. And so we know that the deceased has taken the likeness or has been transfigured into the goddess Hathor in the afterlife. And these shroud types, as you can see, are definitely much more traditional. There's less emphasis on naturalism and realism and more sort of emphasis and alignment with becoming a deity in the afterlife or being associated with Osiris and Hathor. And then these two shroud types here, we have the coffin shrine portrait shroud, which is a type that I identified, where you can see the body is covered with sort of these like rhomboid patterns that are very similar to the type of bandaging and patterning that you would see on the body of a mummified deceased individual. And so that sort of covers the lower body from mid-torso all the way down to the ankles. The feet are exposed because it was important for the deceased to be able to be mobile, to traverse eternity in the afterlife, but also to be mobile physically in the realm of the living as well. The upper part is exposed. There's generally a naturalistic portrait. Maybe you have a gesturing hand that's up sort of in a salutation. In the other hand, they might be holding a garland, a floral wreath. In some cases, we have pomegranates or doves, which have afterlife associations, phonic associations. And then around the head, you have this frame, almost like a doorway. You could call it maybe an edicula, a temple facade, something signifying that this is a sacred space, that the deceased is somehow in a sacred place versus being in a profane space. And then along the sides, you'll have vignettes again with Egyptian gods. So you have a juxtaposition of Hellenistic imagery and traditional Egyptian imagery. And then you have the full body portrait shrouds, where emphasis is really placed on the central figure, on the deceased. And you can see their clothing. You can see they have sort of this contrapposto stance. And then sometimes you'll have Egyptian figures, like in this case, in the background, you'll have an Anubis figure here on the left, sort of protective deities that are meant to help assist the deceased in the afterlife as well. But really the main focus is on the individual and their representation. And then the last portrait shroud type is the tri-figure shroud. Sometimes you hear them referred to as psychopomp shrouds, and that has to do with the fact that you see Anubis and Osiris represented alongside the deceased. So the deceased is in the middle. You can see the stance and the posture is very similar to the full body portrait shrouds, but you have Anubis who's ushering the deceased into the afterlife, who's presenting the deceased. So that's why they get the name psychopomp sometimes. And these are really interesting to unpack. There's a lot going on, as you can see in the decoration of these shrouds. So Osiris is there on one hand, the deceased is being presented, is making an offering to Osiris to be admitted into the afterlife. And then in the background, you have images that represent the deceased's transition. I talked about how you no longer have canopic jars, but actually in the very bottom, in the bottom two registers in between Osiris and the deceased, you have represented canopic jars. So while some of these physical elements were no longer present in the burial, you have them represented on the shrouds. And one of the other traditional elements of tri-figure shrouds is that they're standing on a funerary bark. So that also indicates this transition. And these shrouds, it's a little tricky to see in them. You kind of have to get close up. But something that's really fascinating about these shrouds in particular is that you see these little black stick figures, these little enigmatic figures. And there's still debate as to, what's their purpose? What are they? We don't exactly know. Some of them are up here in the top left by Osiris. You see them sort of hanging out. You also see some at the very bottom. They actually have oars and they're helping to row the funerary bark. Some scholars have suggested that these are souls of the damned. I actually have found in my study that they seem to be more helpful than harmful, and seem to be aiding the deceased in their transition into the afterlife. So there are all kinds of really interesting things that sort of pop up in these shrouds that are, would be relatable to a viewer who's versed in Egyptian artistic traditions and also, Greek and Roman artistic traditions as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really interesting. I'm gonna look at these images more closely later.
Yeah.
While the exhibition centers on these funerary portraits painted in wood that you discussed before, you mentioned, and as attendees who have had a chance to visit the exhibit will know, there is a funerary shroud on display in the exhibition, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about it, and as well tell us a little bit about kind of the way it's displayed, because I know this is significant to making a reading about it.
Yeah, excellent. So this is the shroud of Tasheret-Horudja, as I showed before, and she belongs to the coffin shrine portrait shroud type. You can see her face and her feet are both rendered in a naturalistic style. They would have conformed to the slope of her mummified body, which is why the perspective seems off to us when it's flattened, which is another reason why that's kind of important, thinking about the way that it's displayed, is that it was not meant to be flat. It was obviously on a curved surface, or, the mummified body, which the feet projected upwards, so did the head. She has ornamentation in the center of her body that represents the judgment of her judgment in the afterlife by Osiris, and also her mummification. And then what's also really fascinating is that there are 3 demotic inscriptions that give us a better sense of who she was. So we know her name. We know that her father was a priest in Asyut. So we kind of have a sense that Asyut is likely where, maybe she lived, where she was buried. There's some association, at least, with that particular site, since we don't have the archaeological context in which this was found or excavated. We also know that she was married. And based on the analysis of her inscriptions, her hair, her clothing, everything, we can get a better sense of the dating of this shroud as well. So we can narrow it down to the 1st or 2nd century CE. So she lived and died at some point during that particular period. So there are a lot of really interesting clues in terms of her identity, when she lived, where she might have lived, who she was, who her family was, that we don't necessarily get in a lot of these shrouds. So she's quite a fascinating in person to look at. And so in terms of the display, that question that you asked, you can see here on the left, this is how the shroud had been displayed at the MFA Boston. It's her shroud was up on the wall, mounted on the wall in a large frame. It's a little challenging to see based off of the lighting. You can see sort of a sense of scale how large these shrouds were too. And then here on the right is the shroud displayed in the new exhibition at the Harvard Art Museums. So just shifting that perspective, changing the orientation, gives you a different vantage point, helps you to sort of understand how that shroud would have related to her body, and then also placing it in context with some of the painted portraits, as you mentioned, and masks as well that are also oriented in that horizontal position, helps you think about how all of these objects would have related to the individual's body. And then other objects, there are also so-called mummy labels, which are inscriptions that identify deceased individuals. And putting all of that together in context helps us think about who these individuals were, where these objects would have been found, how they would have been used, helping us ask bigger questions beyond sort of, looking at her Hellenized portrait or looking at the Egyptianized style of the vignettes on her body.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question, but I'm going to also throw it open to attendees if they want to pop a question in the Q&A box. That'll appear to me, and I can read it out there for Lissette to answer. Or I guess my question is maybe a comment, maybe a question, while I wait for people to go ahead and populate the box in our last few minutes. It strikes me that, not only displaying these horizontally helps you remember the context, but in a way, these shrouds are, because they show the whole body, are very more kind of insistently remind a viewer that these are funerary objects that were used, and there's a broader context. And so I wonder if you also, you're not only a specialist in shrouds, but you are a professor of museum studies and a curator. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about kind of display strategies or approaches in kind of communicating these contexts or these important things about individuals to audiences in museums.
Yeah, so I mean, while they all might seem like disparate disciplines, they're actually very interconnected, because when we think about how we interface with ancient civilizations, or most of the public does, it's through exhibitions. And so you can see here, some of the ways that shrouds are traditionally displayed, framed. There are two shrouds in the back. There's one on the far right and one on the left. You're not quite getting the context. You're not quite understanding how they relate to the body. Yes, there are two mummified individuals in this display as well, in this exhibition, but they have funerary masks on them. So those connections aren't necessarily being made to how those shrouds would have related to the body. And other exhibitions too take a more scientific approach, perhaps by revealing more about the deceased individual, who they were, how they died, their pathology, by doing scientific tests like CT scans and X-rays, and also delivering that information and displaying it in exhibits. So I think all of these things together, thinking about how an object is oriented, what kinds of connections can be made, what kinds of information is revealed through the interpretation, by including, say, X-rays, or in the case of the Harvard Art Museums, talking about how objects are made and scientific analysis. All of that gives us a better sense of how these objects were used, and helps us think a little bit more critically about them too, and also thinking about how these objects came into the museum. That's something that my work as a museum studies professor has really helped me think about, and sort of shaped my scholarship in my Egyptology scholarship.
Absolutely, especially before you had kind of contextualized how we don't know what the larger number of these is because of various preservation issues, but also because of the history of the collections. This kind of really shapes what we have access to, or what we're aware of what we have access to right now. We do have a question in the chat, so I'll read the question if you are able to answer. Loretta Zwig asks, it's amazing to her that the shrouds are so well preserved, and she wonders if they're treated with a preservative. Do you have?
Yes, I do know that some of them were, and some of them were treated with preservatives and almost and they were mounted onto boards. I'm not a conservation specialist, so I can't tell you specifically what materials were used, but I do know that early on they were preserved in ways that are not reversible and that would not be done nowadays, that conservators would say, no, that's horrible, that's not actually great. There are some examples. So that's kind of unfortunate in terms of thinking about display, because they're mounted now on boards. They were treated like canvases, and that's part of the reason why some of them are as well preserved as they are today.
Mm-hmm. So sorry, I see another question. So they wouldn't have been coated with anything in particular in antiquity?
No, not in antiquity. No. That a lot of these that's modern conservation and restoration, or relatively modern, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And we have a question from Walter Kaufman. What has happened to the body that the shrouds were wrapping?
That's a good question. In many cases, we don't know. They were likely, I mean, if you read early excavation diaries and reports, excavators were kind of, I use that term loosely, they were finding materials that they thought would be, that the public would like, that they could sell on the art market. They were ripping them off the bodies because it was too difficult to ship entire mummified individuals. And it was much easier to just sort of take what they thought would be valuable and what people would like. And so many of those bodies were probably left in Egypt or discarded. Even bodies that did enter museum displays or museum collections were sometimes discarded, and their funerary shrouds were kept.
Yeah, it occurs to me that kind of the changing idea about what these objects or these materials are, shrouds first, as kind of art objects versus objects used, also applies to how there have been changes about what how the bodies of the deceased themselves have been considered, whether they're valued, and how they're valued over time as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So we do have a question from the curator of the show, one of the curators of the show, also from Susanna Ebbinghaus, so I'll read it. Do you think shrouds or other elements of Egyptian burials, especially mummified individuals, should be there in their own area of a museum gallery? And what has your experience been in San Francisco?
That's a really good question. At my institution in particular, we do put them in a different area. We have, in part because of their association with mummified individuals, with bodies, and out of respect. I think that that's a really interesting conversation that we see happening more and more, and a potential shift in practice in terms of thinking of these representations as extensions of the body, because that's essentially what they were in ancient times. And so giving them the sort of the space, almost like creating a space for them in particular where they can be viewed in, for lack of a better word, reverence almost, or giving them an element of respect that we would also give with human remains. I think that would be really interesting to see that shift. And I think that would also help us shift away from viewing these objects as works of art, and thinking about them more as extensions of the body and as cultural objects that represented the deceased individual.
Absolutely. So I guess, the changes that in practice at our museum, for example, that are coming with this exhibition are not the end of changes. There's, always a continuing dialogue about what's the best practice to display these things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think we're at time, a little bit over. So I want to thank you for being such a great guest and sharing your expertise with us. I want to thank everyone who attended. the talk. And I invite you to join us on Zoom for the next conversations around funerary portraits taking place on Wednesday, November 9th, when conservator Haddon Dine and exhibition co-curator and conservation scientist Georgina Rayner will discuss how three-dimensional funerary portraits were made. Thanks so much for coming, and visit the exhibition in Cambridge if you can, and the online tool if you are able as well. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.